This should, there we go.
Okay, well, I'll just start in by saying thank you all for attending. As I mentioned before, but I'll restate, the town received a petition to implement a local food ordinance, a specific ordinance. So the selectmen, doing their due diligence, came up with a committee to help research the topic and look at potential impacts, both positive and negative, economic, food security, food safety, etc., and report back to them so they can make a recommendation. No matter what, as a petitioned ordinance, it does come to the town to a vote, depending on how long it takes us to get all this information. And then the selectmen have, I believe, up until next town meeting at the latest to vote on it. But they can choose another alternate venue if they want to focus on that versus put it in with the town warrant.
I still have a question. You mentioned you have a petition. Are you fostering that petition? Who's
No, the petition was Lisa, I believe, was the one who spearheaded the petition. That was at the last town meeting. I know shortly after that they were gathering signatures. I mean, the town vote, but around that time, and they got enough signatures to submit it. So the petition was to have the town vote on a local food ordinance. And so that's what we are researching, is the potential impacts.
Was there a need for this? Has there been problems?
Well, that's the primary question. And if you can hold off now, Len, and everyone will get a turn to speak. But let me finish with my introduction. What we are here as a committee is to find out information as much as we can. We keep an open mind, trying to find out, as I mentioned, the positives and negatives. And so one of the basic information pieces that we're looking at is this needed? Given Maine's current laws regarding food production and safety and stuff like that, and what impact will this ordinance, proposed ordinance, have? How will it benefit or potentially have negative consequences? So what the purpose of this meeting is to invite people to share information that'll help us to determine that. And I'm just going to ask that whenever someone initially speaks, if they can identify themselves, as you did earlier, Sarma, say what town you're from. If you're not from Steuben, what you're interested in regards to this ordinance. I would also ask, since we're starting already kind of, 6 o'clock is not early. If someone's already brought information up or made a point, we don't need to repeat it. This is not a debate. It's not convincing us. We're just looking for information. So if the information has been brought to us, then it's been brought to us. There's no need to repeat it. That'll help keep the meeting in a reasonable time constraint, I would think. But if you have something to say that hasn't been brought up, by all means, please do speak. And I guess we'll either indicate by speaking by raising your hand, or when someone is done speaking, verbally say so, or in the chat, and we'll take turns talking. So with that, I would propose that, Lisa, since you were the one who proposed put the ordinance out there as a petition, maybe from your perspective, why is this needed? What are the current state regulations that are particularly burdensome that is preventing people from growing, sharing, selling their food?
Sure. Well, I have a little bit of a narrow perspective. I'm Lisa Reilich. I live in the town of Steuben since 1999. And I've been operating Painted Pepper Farm and Dairy Delights Creamery since 2005. And we are a fully licensed commercial value-added dairy here in Steuben. So I got licensed in 2005 in a very, very friendly to new farmers, new food producers environment. The rules when I got licensed were, as long as you're selling it on your farm and you're not going off your farm with food, it's fine. You don't need to be licensed. Go ahead. And this is what I was told by inspectors and by the Department of Agriculture. Go ahead and try things out. Make sure you know what you're doing, because it does take some time to actually get your inspections in place and get your licenses and everything like that. So that was the environment that I came into commercial farming in 2005. And then I kind of didn't pay attention because I was licensed. But about 3 years ago, I really started to pay attention to that things were changing radically on my front, which I'm concerned as a dairy farmer. That the regulatory burden on me as a producer was getting more and more difficult. There were more and more testing requirements for the animals, requirements that had been allowed or had been dismissed for me as a heat treating dairy. That means that we heat treat our milk. We don't pasteurize it. Now I needed to do extensive animal testing that had been waived for the last 15 years, et cetera. Things kept moving in that direction. And I started to wonder what was going on. And I think it's around then, about 2 years ago, that I spoke with Heather, who's a fellow farmer, and said, "Hey, I think you're involved with that Maine Food Sovereignty Act. What the heck is going on? What has changed?" And Heather kind of said, "Well, it changed a while ago. You just weren't paying attention." So Heather's going to be able to speak better to things outside of the dairy farming world. But I do know that the regulatory environment for new dairies, I've come to find out as I've come across people who are buying animals from me, et cetera, to start their dairies, has gotten very, very strict, and that there is a move in the Maine Department of Agriculture to align more and more with USDA requirements. What does this mean from my perspective? USDA does not allow heat treated milk. USDA does not allow raw milk. USDA does not really allow microprocessors. In some cases, it doesn't allow you to hand pour milk into a bottle. You have to have a machine that does that. So it's geared towards industrial agriculture, and it is prohibitive and expensive. Just to give you an idea, a vat pasteurizer for 10 gallons of milk 7 years ago was $20,000. Now it's $40,000. So it's not something easy to do. And so now you cannot sell milk or cheese, which I'm a dairy farm, so that's what I'm concerned about. You cannot sell any of these things from your doorstep to your neighbor. It is illegal. It is not allowed unless our town opts in to the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, as I understand it. Heather will correct me if I'm wrong, and adopts a local food and community self-governance ordinance. That's the partner piece. We have to opt in to the law that was passed in Maine. And so that's why, as a dairy farmer, I think it's needed. I think Heather and Billy Bob can speak more to other farms and how that would affect them. Hope that helps. But that's why I brought it forward. I brought it forward in November as something, and at the time, Larry Pinkham was the selectman, and he was really interested in this, and that was the environment that it started in, and that's where we are now.
Thank you, Lisa. And maybe this will be a question for Heather. I'm curious. So is it new legislation that was passed, or is it just the regulations under existing legislation that's being interpreted by the government, staff, that's changed from the way it was? I thought I could not find anything where it said it's any law that prohibited the sale of unpasteurized milk.
Oh, you can license as a raw dairy, but you can no longer, as an unlicensed, as a farmer who's producing dairy products, unless your town has adopted the local food and community self-governance ordinance. And Heather can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've had other farmers tell me the same thing that are goat dairy farmers. Unless you are licensed by the state of Maine, you are not allowed to exchange, sell, give, barter any dairy products with anybody unless you're licensed.
But the license is the license that's been around for a long, long time now, the home food processing license, or is there a different license?
It's a different, the license, there are several different licenses. So there is a home food processing license. A dairy license is totally different. So we have a home food processing license and a dairy license. They're two different things because we do two different
Mhm.
things. But you can't, like on a home food processing license, you cannot work with dairy products. That's not allowed. Like you can't make your own ice cream. You know, if I was licensed to sell bread and cookies and cake, unless I have a dairy license, I can't also make ice cream to go with that bread, cookies, and cake. And that's the way it's been for a long time. So that you are correct, Keith. That is the way it's been. But the difference is in how the law is being enforced. So it used to be, we're going to look the other way. At least this was my experience. We're going to look the other way. We're not going to come knock on your door. If you're just selling it to neighbors, we don't care. But if you're going to farmers markets, that's a problem. And you can't go sell to a store and you can't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that changed. And then from my standpoint, there have been rules that have changed. For instance, with a closed herd, I used to have to only test my animals for brucellosis once when I first started my herd. Starting 3 years ago, I have to have them tested every 3 years unless I'm selling pasteurized milk. I would have to invest in that $40,000 pasteurizer. If I'm selling heat treated milk every 3 years, and I can't just do this testing, I have to do it unless I have 100 animals. Then I can do 10% of my animals, but under 100 animals, I have to do every single breeding age and milking age animal on the farm. I have to have a vet come out and do that. They are about to get rid of being able to tattoo your goats and register them. They're about to make it mandatory that you have to microchip your animals, which comes into a problem with what we're burying in the ground when animals are composted. So this is really big concern, and it's a really big departure and change. And my bill for this brucellosis testing that I wasn't expecting was $1,300 in February. That's a huge bill when you're a small dairy that's grossing $40,000 and breaking even. That's a really big bill to prove that your animals don't have a disease in a closed herd that they never had. So that's just one example. There are many, many examples like that are coming down on food processors and producers. So hopefully that helps kind of paint the picture of what's going on.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's how they're enforcing previously existing laws. Heather, do you want to speak to that?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Keith. I don't know if I've met everybody here. I've met John, I think past in the last winter. So hi, John. Thank you, Lisa, for the invitation. And hello, Billy Bob. It's been a long time since I saw you in person too. Nice to see you. Billy Bob and I worked together on the constitutional amendment to enshrine the right to food in our Constitution. So we go back a little ways, not as long as since this all started, as Lisa was mentioning. So I'm trying to figure out where would be a good point to drop in terms of context, history, the whys and wherefores. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds without telling you what the ordinance is and does, and how the Maine Food Sovereignty Act supports that, and then even how the right to food supports that. But maybe the easiest thing to kind of give everybody a thumbnail sketch about what I'm doing here. I am a dairy farmer, not just a dairy farmer. We have a small diversified farm in Penobscot in Hancock County. I believe we're the only dairy left in Hancock County. So again, that's a little bit of that contextual piece, Keith, that you're looking for about what's
What
changed.
town are you in?
I'm in the town of Penobscot in Hancock County.
Okay.
We used to have quite a few dairies here in Hancock County, enough to have a creamery. There was Footman's Creamery and Brewer that a lot of dairy farmers in Hancock County shipped to, and all of those things are gone. There is no longer, there are no longer local creameries. There are no local dairies. We have a couple goat's milk dairies down on Deer Isle, but we're getting fewer and farther between. The big picture, if you kind of study the history of agriculture and regulations, is the federal regulations are always pushing towards centralization and specialization, and the local food movement is pulling back towards diversification. If we have diversified enterprises on our farm, That's better for the ecology, that's better for the land, that's better for the soil. And then we also need diversified income streams to remain as flexible and adaptable as possible. And I can give you some examples of why that's important. But the rules, as Lisa was mentioning, at the federal level, the USDA governs meat and poultry, and the FDA is about milk and drugs. Interestingly, that raw milk is right in the category with drugs and called hazardous white substance. So these terms matter in terms of how what our relationship to food is in our communities, and the contrast to what the relationship to food is at the federal level, where industrial agriculture and corporations are the ones writing the rules. So it's kind of important context to know. Up until 2009, Keith, any farmer who had dairy, according to our state, could sell from a farm as long as you didn't advertise. And around that time, 2009, 2010, there started becoming a lot of downward pressure from the FDA at the federal level to eradicate raw milk from all states. And Maine was feeling that pressure and starting to change rules. The farmers of our scale weren't defined in statute. And this becomes really important as we track the history of food sovereignty in Maine. There was no word to describe what we're doing. There wasn't the word farmer, that still doesn't exist in statute, or the word producer. So there was only a milk distributor. So a milk distributor, just to parse that out, is somebody who aggregates, not usually a farm at all, somebody who aggregates milk in one place and then distributes it out to other places. So calling small farms of our scale milk distributors is not only inaccurate, it had a lot of, as Lisa mentioned, cost prohibitive infrastructure requirements that made no sense for the scale and had nothing to do with the food safety. So when that started changing in 2009, it was simultaneous with USDA rules being implemented at the state level around chicken. And again, the scale matters. There was a 1,000 bird exemption that had allowed farms to slaughter and sell chicken directly from our farms with no licensing or inspection. And that began to change in 2009. That's where I got involved because an inspector came down our driveway. We had been slaughtering our chickens at a neighboring farm's USDA licensed state inspected facility, but the USDA rule said that you could not share. And so we weren't going to be allowed to do that, even though the farm was just 5 miles away. There's an exemption that the USDA or the state could grant, and we were told that that had been often asked for and never granted. So our friend wasn't going to be allowed to share his facility with us, and we would have to build our own. At the time, we were only raising 300 chickens, and to build a facility, the infrastructure was just well beyond the scale of the farm and also the ecology of the farm. Had we had to raise enough chickens to pay for the facility, that would no longer be way too much chicken manure for this soil, for this land, for the amount of acreage we had. So everything was getting out of whack and balance. At that same time that those rules were changing, the inspector came down our driveway and said, we're also re-examining how people make milk available in the state, and you're not going to be allowed to do this anymore. And that particular process changed it for me from being about scale appropriate regulations, which is all we went to the state and asked for those. He said, gather your people. So we did, and we were told that the legislators' hands were tied and they couldn't make these rules any different than they were without losing funding for Maine's meat inspection program. And so that was about scale appropriateness. But what was changing with dairy in the state of Maine was that there was this redefining who we were and what we did. And that also came with expensive facility requirements that were well beyond our scale, but that was changing within the executive branch of government. And there was no way for the public to weigh in. There was no representation for our legislators to weigh in with the agencies. It was happening between agencies of government. And so that felt like a fundamental flaw of or dysfunction of democracy. And that's when it became much less about scale appropriate regulations and much more about the voice of people in our own communities who eat food, who didn't want their access restricted, and there were no food safety issues to bring these changes of rules. And these rules were never designed for our scale of farming. As long as people are exchanging food directly amongst each other, that food had always been outside of any kind of regulatory purview, because it's the safest food that you can possibly produce when it's happening in your own community and it's only going from the farmer to the eater. So then it really became about democracy and about food sovereignty. And that is about the time when we started working on drafting the first version of the ordinance that the town of Steuben now has in front of it. And the, again, nutshell version of this is that the first ordinances that we wrote relied on a provision in our state constitution called "Power is inherent in the people." That's Article 1, Section 2 of our Declaration of Rights in Maine's Constitution, and then also Home Rule, which stated that if for the purposes of well-being of a town, citizens, towns can take up matters of local importance and health and well-being. And so those were the two pieces of statute that we based our first rights-based ordinance on, and exempted ourselves from state licensing and inspection requirements. Not from rulemaking, not from regulations, but from the inspection and licensing requirements that ceded the jurisdiction, that ceded the decision-making over our food choices and our relationships in our community to the state. The state could make cooperative agreements with funding attached to these federal agencies and or corporations that were undermining our local food system. So the way that we took back the authority to define ourselves and what we do is by writing this local food ordinance, the third iteration that you have in front of you now, the third being because over the course of these 15 years, we've been successful in working with our legislators to support what the communities of Maine did. So in 2011, the first local food and community self-governance ordinances were passed in Hancock County, in Penobscot, in Blue Hill, in Sedgwick, and then in Trenton. Since that time, broad fast forward overview, these ordinances have spread across the state of Maine, so that now about 25% of Maine's towns and cities have some version of this ordinance. And again, just creating, protecting a legal space for local food exchanges between direct producer to consumer transactions is the way we've worded it in state statute, for those direct producer to consumer transactions to continue without licensing and inspection. And like I say, the early ordinances have been in place since 2011. Previous to that, that was just the de facto way that farms were able to sell food directly to people. So it wasn't so much a change, Keith, as it was a preservation of a system that was working and a resistance to the kind of downward pressure of centralization and specialization that the USDA and FDA rules require, if not full disappearance of small farms from our communities and from our landscape. So that's how it started. That's how it's going. When the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was passed, that was in 2017. And there were at that point only 20 towns in the state of Maine that had enacted this ordinance. And the basic ask of the Maine Food Sovereignty Act to the legislature was to recognize municipal authority to govern our direct food exchanges between a producer and a consumer, a farmer and or a food producer. So food producer being people that prepare food in their home and sell it. And so the Maine Food Sovereignty Act recognized the authority of municipalities like Steuben to enact local food ordinance exempting, keeping that layer of exemption intact between producers, processors, and people who want to buy food from them. And I think I can stop there because I have a feeling that may be enough of a broad brush stroke about what the ordinance is there for. And where it came from. You know, after 15 years, I think the origin story can kind of get lost, but it really was written by, it was written here actually in my farmhouse kitchen table by farmers and farm workers and people who eat food in our community that wanted to, like Sarma and Len, preserve their access to real food. So that's how it all started. And I don't know if Billy Bob wants to say something too. Billy Bob and I met in 2019, when Billy Bob took up the proposal, the resolution to amend our constitution to secure this one step further with the right to food, and that's when we started working together. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Heather. I'm just one point of clarification, and it is confusing when I try to search it online. There still is, at least in the books, that 1,000-bird exemption, but it's not really an exemption. I don't quite understand how, if they say there's a 1,000-bird exemption, then they can say, no, you've got a 300-bird flock, you can't do these things.
No, that is a really, really good question. So that's why it's difficult for me to know at what point in time to drop into. So in 2009, what I was describing was happening, and the state was moving away from, they were moving towards requiring facilities that were beyond the scale of most small farmers that were raising 1,000 birds or less to build. So we worked together with our legislators at that point. Representative Kamiga from Deer Isle here, closer to us. Then Representative Hickman was a co-sponsor, and we worked legislatively to create an exemption that worked better. And that's what's on the books now. So there's no facilities requirement, but some labeling requirements, and the state wants farmers to register with them. But the facility requirements that were part of that exemption proposal in 2010 are no longer there because of the work that our legislative allies and supporters were able to accomplish and get a better working chicken exemption, poultry exemption in place for people now.
Okay, so as it stands now, just to clarify, a small under 1,000 flock producer, would you say it's particularly burdensome to sell birds from their farm?
No, now it's a good working exemption, again, because of the work that we were able to do and the support that we got in our legislature to carve out that space. And it should also be noted that the local food ordinance that you have in front of you does not exempt meat and poultry from licensing and inspection requirements. That is a legal, I guess the term to use is the USDA has completely occupied the legal field when it comes to meat and poultry. So we had to amend the Maine Food Sovereignty Act to carve out meat and poultry because the USDA threatened at that point to take over Maine's meat inspection program if communities could govern our own meat and poultry exchanges. So meat and poultry are not part of the ordinance in front of you.
And another quick question, I don't know if you're aware of this, but my understanding, what I read of also the ordinance is that even from federal stuff, is there an exemption for if someone raises a cow and someone sells the whole cow, raises a whole cow for someone else, that's also exempt? Or a whole other animal, versus parts?
I'm not sure I understand. Are you asking if somebody can raise a whole animal, butcher it, and sell it to someone from their farm?
Yeah, and that's exempt from the requirements if it's a whole animal purchase, not like divided into parts or anything
right.
like
So
that.
the answer to that is actually yes and no. There are allowed in the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. Oh, did you want to jump in, Billy Bob?
Well, I was going to say, and also unapplicable to the people will buy a whole or a half of a cow off of somebody. Is that what he's describing?
Yeah, that's what I'm describing, Billy Bob.
Yeah. So did you want to answer that, Billy Bob, or do you want me to keep going?
Go ahead, keep going, Heather.
Okay, so the most recent amendment that Billy Bob sponsored of the Maine Food Sovereignty Act has been amended now, I think 3 times or twice. But the most recent amendment Billy Bob sponsored was to update the definition of direct producer to consumer transaction. The original definition that was in the 2017 Maine Food Sovereignty Act conflicted with other language in the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. And the state was willing to update it to our definition from the local food ordinance, which was, thanks to Billy Bob, it was an enormous victory. The Department of Agriculture had fought this for years and then promoted it and supported it. Because again, these ordinances have been in place now for 14 years and have a great track record. So the definition that you have in the ordinance in front of you now, I wanted to bring it up so I could actually give you the exact language that is allowed.
Yeah, I see. I've got it in front of me.
And that is, and I'll just read it for, Len and Sarma too. A direct producer to consumer transaction means an exchange of food or food products directly between a food producer and a consumer by barter, trade, or purchase on the property or premises owned, leased, or rented by the food producer, at roadside stands, fundraisers, farmers markets, and community social events, or through buying clubs, deliveries, or CSAs, herd share agreements, and other private agreements. So those kind of herd share agreements that you're talking about, Keith, there is this carve out now to make that possible. And again, that has to be, that would be like if Len and Sarma came to our farm and said, I want to buy a whole beef, or half of it with some neighbors of ours, and will you butcher it? And, we'll buy the live animal. And there's some very, very specific ways that the USDA recognizes that to be a legal arrangement, which is why we could include it in.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was more getting at, is that the USDA was already recognized previously, even before this local food ordinance, that was, you didn't have to, like, that's been going on. And I don't know if it's just not been enforced, but then when I actually read it, I read that legally, even before these local food ordinances, that was an exemption, that a herd share, a farmer could sell in that way without having to go through, the USDA other, requirements.
It was a bit of a gray area, and like you said, there are certain things that happen in the state of Maine that the Department of Agriculture has always willingly looked aside from. In custom butchering, it's all about meat. Most of it's about meat because it's become so difficult to have local slaughterhouses. And that's, again, we can talk about that if you'd like. But when we wrote the herd share agreements into the original Maine Food Sovereignty Act, we took that language out so that it would pass, and then went back 6 years later, or now with that Billy Bob, that was last year, right, Billy Bob? So that was, 6 years after the original Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed, we were able to go back and make that explicitly, articulately clear. If, one thing we've learned over the course of all of these years of going back and forth with language and back and forth with our state agencies and legislators, is that language really matters. And so we made sure to explicitly articulate that herd share agreements are permitted.
Okay, thank you.
Can I share something for just a second, just tagging on to that, Len, right before you go? The language really does matter, and what also matters is who is in the position to enforce the rules. And the change that I'm seeing happen is that maybe the rules haven't changed that much, but the way they're being enforced is much more heavy-handed. There is the ability to enforce them in a way that makes it very difficult as a small farmer or food producer to of a very small scale, like under 100,000 gross, to do business. So I just wanted to add that, and that is a change that I've been slowly seeing happen over the last 6 years on my very limited, as a dairy farm. And I've been seeing that change very slowly, I feel like a frog that's getting boiled. So it's very slowly happening. And that's when I finally reached out to Heather and said, wait a second, why is this going on? I thought we passed the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. And that's when I found out we have to opt in. We have to opt in.
Glenn?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for identifying all of you. And I know some of you are farmers, one's a member of the legislature. But just so you know who we are, we're pretty much small business advocates. I've been a professor in small business or business in Houston. We did move here about 2.5 years ago. And we're not farmers, we're certainly end users. We've made a number of friends here in Steuben, and I think that in many ways we represent a lot of what end users want to be able to do is continue the good food that we've been able to get here, that we've been fortunate to be able to get here from local farms. Saying that, then I look at and listen to the issues and being involved in education, I'm just wondering how similar this seems to be to the fisheries issues that it was solved by the Supreme Court not long ago, when they basically said and ruled that the government agencies cannot interpret, have their own laws, that the laws have to come from the actually passed by the government. In this particular case, I'm wondering how much this is the same, very similar. Is this the same situation that the fisheries incurred, in which the agency itself is pushing its own rules ahead of what are maybe cannot be identified as laws, especially when Billy Bob says he can't find the laws that specifically say that. And if that's the case, is this rule or this ordinance just unconstitutional?
I really want to defer on the fisheries issue to Billy Bob, as Billy Bob is a fisherman, and I think it'd be probably really helpful also to hear from Billy Bob as your representative about when you first came to the legislature. I understand that you found then Representative Hickman and said, I'm a big food sovereignty supporter, and it might be helpful to hear why that is. And the constitutional question I can answer later. I was just able to co-author an article about the constitutional right to food now with a legal professor, but I feel like the fisheries issue and hearing from Billy Bob about why you got involved with all of us might be really helpful.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. There's been a lot said, so my mind is just kind of going everywhere right now. But I'm Billy Bob Faulkingham. I'm the state representative for this district that runs from Hancock in the west to Steuben in the east. And I've been a long time supporter of what I call food freedom. And the concept of food sovereignty, in my mind, is keeping food systems local and having food access to food locally close to you. And that's the way mankind has lived for 5,000 years or so. But now it's really gone away from that, and it's difficult to find local food. And that's not because local people can't grow and produce safe food. It's because of what has happened to our food system. And so in the state of Maine, over 90 from out of state. So I feel like we're in a very dangerous position. We just saw in 2020, when we had a worldwide pandemic, thankfully things didn't get as bad as they could, but it wouldn't have been crazy to see the store shelves empty. And if that's the case, where are you going to get your food from? So it's very important that a lot of people, and myself, I've been moving more in this direction. I want healthy local food. I know that if it's local, that it's healthy. I have more trust in it. And I think, I don't know if everybody was paying attention, but I know I certainly did. It's been on the radio constantly, but there was a huge listeria outbreak from Boar's Head meat products. And so for us people that have been in this food sovereignty, food freedom type of movement for a long time, that's not unusual to us. That's where anytime you see these huge listeria or food poisoning or food outbreaks, it always comes in the regulated food. It always comes from the FDA inspected food, because the corporate food is big batches and it goes out to millions of people and it's widespread. That is never the case with local food. Local food, you could scour the internet and you will not find where people have died from purchasing local food, but you will see it all the time, these outbreaks of the FDA food. So regardless of whether a person chooses that food or not, we believe that people should be able to have access to local food, and we need to. The reason why there aren't local food producers is because it's cost prohibitive. The regulations, the costs of all these government things, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. It's like Lisa was saying about this one machine that cost $40,000. Well, I'm sorry, if you want to get a few cows and produce some milk for a small network of your local neighbors, you should be able to do that without going out of business. Another story that was pretty recent was that Holton Farms Dairy stopped running their line of milk. That was the only dairy farm north of Portland. These are important things that we should pay attention to. So the Food Sovereignty Act was passed in 2017. I think it's very important for everybody to know there was a Democrat-controlled House, a Republican-controlled Senate, and Paul LePage, who didn't get along with either of them as the governor. And this law overwhelmingly passed the Democrat House, the Republican Senate, and was signed into law by Paul LePage. I think that is a sign of how great of a law this was that was passed. The Food Sovereignty Act was one of the greatest pieces of legislation that's been passed in the state of Maine this century. Since it's been passed, and Heather said this, 25% of the towns in Maine have opted into this. I think it's also important to know that there are certain things that aren't included in this law, like meat production. So that's kind of off the table. So you don't have to worry about that. And so they're allowed within this act anyway. So, and towns enact these ordinances. And what it does is it allows people to, and some of these businesses that start up under the Food Sovereignty Act will go on to be licensed food producers. But it's kind of actually similar to a law we have in marine resources with aquaculture, where we have, I think they're called LOAs limited, or anyways, they're smaller leases so that people can try out aquaculture and see if it's successful before they get bigger ones. Well, that's kind of what the Food Sovereignty Act is with a lot of these food producers. It lets people start out into it without all the cost prohibitive restrictions, requirements, and then they might go on and get licensed. But it allows people to make small batch food products and sell them within their own town to their neighbors. So I'm a big supporter of it. I think it's kind of I think sometimes people that don't follow it as closely as some of us that do are a little bit skeptical of it, and they think maybe like there's some outlier or they're the first, municipality that's ever tried it or something like that. I can assure you that's not the case. It's going well, and from small municipalities to big municipalities all over the state.
Hey, Billy
And
Bob,
yeah,
Just-
go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, but you're from Winter Harbor, right?
Yes.
Does Winter Harbor pass this?
No, we haven't.
Why not? Have you introduced it?
Because probably just because I've never gone to this, to the town to get it passed. I've thought about it. I don't produce any food, so I haven't really had a pressing need for it. It's a small town, 500 people, and nobody down here is looking to do anything like that. But I'd like to get it passed just so we can be one of the towns on the list. I think there's definitely more of a demand for it in Steuben. You have some, farming activity and things like that, and I think it would certainly be a good ordinance to pass in Steuben.
I would just add, Keith, I just wanted to add that Gouldsboro, early before the Maine Food Sovereignty Act got passed, Bill Thayer took it to his, he was a selectman and he took it to his board, and they passed something that isn't quite this. So I'm hoping that Gouldsboro, the Scoodic Peninsula, does, that Steuben leads the way to all the local towns doing this. I know there's some interest in Gouldsboro from some producers there. There's some interest in Millbridge. There's some interest in Cherryfield. So I'm hoping that Steuben can lead the way on this.
So
Can I ask a question?
1 second, just from what I've heard, and then I'll get to you, Lynn. I've heard dairy, there's been some major things going on with dairy. It's clear that this law will help with dairy. Meat's excluded, as we've said, generally, except for maybe herd share. But what about everything other than dairy? Is this ordinance going to have a big impact or not? I mean, it seemed like there's not that. I mean, fresh vegetables, you don't even need to be licensed to sell, as far as I know. Other processed food, the home food processing license doesn't seem very burdensome, but I don't know if anyone can speak to, or either directly or third hand, how other aspects other than dairy are needing to be freed from overly burdensome regulation.
I can speak a little bit to the home processing license. It kind of goes back to what Heather was saying about being a diversified business. If you're a small family enterprise, you're not going to make your bread and butter on one thing. So, for instance, we make granolas, we make nuts, we make some jams. That is all covered underneath the home processing license. I don't know if it would be burdensome now. I can tell you that when I started, it was a little bit burdensome. I had to go through the University of Maine Food Lab and get special equipment, which could be good equipment to have anyway. I thought it was good equipment to have anyway. pH meters and temperature meters to make sure that the jam had proper acidification. I had to submit my recipe. So at the start, it was kind of burdensome, but I was into it. So I was like, sure, I'll do it. I want to know anyway. But I would say that what I'm thinking of is, like, I know my neighbor makes cheesecakes and she sells them. And I think she should be able to make cheesecakes and regular cakes and cookies and sell them and not have to go through any kind of licensing. I think that just the fact that somebody has to license can discourage. And I know, and I presented this to the town of Steuben, the selectmen, a couple weeks ago. When I started, I was just making granola in my kitchen with my toddler. That is a core memory. It's a really important experience. And I wasn't licensed at that time. I was experimenting, and there was the freedom to do that directly to other consumers, not to sell to stores. I couldn't wholesale, but I could, with the way the law was interpreted, I could do that in my kitchen prior to being licensed and experiment and see if I liked it. And I think that's really important for our high school students, for our moms that need an extra stream of income. Childcare is incredibly prohibitive. If they could stay home and have a small bit of income from making processed foods out of what they're getting out of their garden, making cakes, making cookies, making muffins. I think that's all legitimate.
Thank you,
Can I-
Lisa. Len?
Can I speak?
Yep, Len, go ahead.
Okay, we've had some very interesting experiences in a very political environment, as we know across the country that exist. Our company actually worked with a small muffin company, actually a woman and her husband, to create a little retail muffin shop. That muffin shop took 16 inspections in about 6 months before it could even operate. And that was in downtown Houston, very democratic city, loaded with inspectors from top to bottom. This has become a political aspect of what our society is happening to our society. And it's a creep. You start with one, and again, they add more, and before you know it, doesn't end. So my question is, Heather, you're the direct farmer. If we pass this ordinance, if we say yes to this, are we going to find ourselves with even more problems down the road, or do we have to ask our legislature to deal head on? And I know the Attorney General is Democrat, so she's not going to take the case up. But where do we go to make sure that all this pressure that you have, extreme pressure, financial and everything else, doesn't continue even after we say yes, or we follow the approval of your ordinance?
Right. Oh, yeah, that's a hard question. And I hope I can still weave together some of what Keith was saying. I think is directly related, his question to your question. And it was reminding me then when you were talking, when this all first started in 2011, at that point, the Department of Agriculture, was not supportive. And thankfully, a big part of doing this work at the state level is that we're not opponents anymore, right? That we put the law back behind what the people were doing. And when we did that, it was one of the best moments. The acting director of the Quality Assurance and Regulation Division reached out and shook my hand, and he was grinning, and he just said, "Congratulations. Like, we're not opponents anymore. We don't need to be where we don't need to be." And one of the stories at the beginning that I thought was so illustrative of what was going on was when at the very beginning of 2011, the Department of Agriculture sued a one cow farmer in East Blue Hill. And so there was a lawsuit, went all the way to the Maine Supreme Court. But the story it most reminded me of was Aesop's fable, right? Because before we started our farm, we called the Department of Agriculture to see what did we need to do before we started selling food to our community. And the Aesop's fable that I shared was one about the camel and his nose. And it's a cold desert night, and maybe some of you know this story. I was a homeschooling mother throughout all of this too, so all of this kind of was of a piece for me. But the camel just asks the people in the tent, "It's very cold out here in the desert at night. Could I just put my nose in your tent?" And of course, the people said, of course, we don't want you to be cold. Poor camel, put your nose in our tent. And then how about just my head? Could I just put my head in your tent? And could I just put my neck and my shoulders? And of course, eventually the camel takes over the tent and the people have to leave their tent. And I did really feel like that was a very illustrative analogy of what was happening. And like I said, we see this all around us in Hancock County, that small farms have disappeared, but there's been a resurgence. And so we wanted to put the rule of law, keep the rule of law behind this local food system, because otherwise it slowly got disappeared. And then, people would say, "Oh, we remember that farm was there. It must just be that farming is really hard, and that's why people quit." But we were getting disappeared by the pen of policy in faraway places that had nothing to do with the relationships that we have in our community or the type of food that we're producing. So I think where that comes into play with Keith's question about other food, what about food besides meat and dairy? I can tell you, because I've sat in those public hearing rooms in our state legislature over and over and over again, I've learned about a lot of things that I never would have known about, and can just commend our legislators to you for being regular people like us who have to learn about quite a breadth of topics. So I heard people there that were saying the same things that we were about, in terms of scale appropriateness, about rabbits, about honey, about New Zealand water spinach, about my mind is going to start failing me. My brain is getting tired, but about many different types of individual foods, Keith. And it occurred to me like that this is what farmers can't do. There are very few farmers, I can tell you, that are like myself, that are even going to go to the state capitol, and let alone stay involved for 15 years to keep this space carved out for a local food system, and have that kind of persistence over time, the temerity, the longevity. We can't go to the state legislature every time we want to protect one more food. And we are seeing at the time, when this all began in 2010, the Food Safety Modernization Act at the time was called S510. It was working its way through our federal Congress. And it was openly said, repeatedly said, that yes, it was going to be a trade-off, that we were going to lose small farms, but we needed to regionalize. We needed to get more production for wholesaling, and yeah, an unfortunate trade-off would be that we would lose small farms. Well, that wasn't an acceptable course. It wasn't an acceptable trajectory. Had we not done anything, and again, at that time, there were a number of foodborne illness outbreaks, like Billy Bob was talking about, with spinach in particular, and with greens. And again, I can talk about why that is, and moving through multiple channels of distribution. It's downstream from CAFOs. They are producing food in ways that food should not be produced, which increases the risk exponentially. And so it became important not just to protect meat and dairy, but to protect our local food system. And the question that became more and more important was not just what are the rules, but who is deciding the rules? Who are those rules benefiting? Who are those rules harming? And so the food sovereignty piece that moved us from food freedom being just about we want exemptions, statewide exemptions. There are other states that have done that. We moved also in this direction of food sovereignty, food freedom, but food sovereignty, that it's the people who eat food and the people who are growing the food that should decide the rules about how we exchange that food. And that's food sovereignty. And that is what the state has recognized as being important for the continuation of a local food system, not just to sort of survive in the margins quietly, not advertising. Sometimes along this whole path, I've felt more like we are drug dealers needing to meet people in parking lots rather than having to hide that we're farmers, rather than being able to do honorable work in an honorable way. So yeah, it was important that we wrote in not just this thing is about to disappear, let's quick try to do something. There is no quick about any of this, right? I mean, like I said, this is going back to 2009, 2010. And it was our local food system that we were trying to protect, and we are answering those questions about who's deciding what's happening in our communities right now. What are the relationships that we want to have in our community, and how do we encode that into law? And that's what we did. And it did take a while to go back to the question of constitutionality. We started off rooting it in our state constitution in a contentious way that the state didn't recognize. We didn't expect the state to recognize it right away. But after 6 years, the state did recognize it. And then in 2021, to just jump forward in time and with absolutely no history, in 2021, the legislature, by an almost 3/4 majority, we needed a 2/3 supermajority. We got 3/4 majority, put out to the people, did we want to enshrine a right to food in our constitution, which includes this food freedom component Billy Bob was talking about. It includes the right to the food of our own choosing for our own nourishment. So if I'm now speaking as a food eater and not a farmer, who's making the choices about what food I put in my body? And now in our constitution, Maine, the only one in the whole entire country, it says that's up to the people. individuals to decide for themselves. So we have now this stronger rooting in constitutional law, the strongest kind of law that exists, that protects this with the stature of law that is a right, a constitutional right. And that's, of course, enormously helpful in supporting these local food ordinances as well. We just haven't updated them yet. We haven't updated them to include the right to food, but for our next trick, we'll do that.
Thank you, Heather. So we've been going for about an hour, and I just want to check in with those who haven't spoken at all yet to make sure that they have a chance if they want. John, Laura, Jim, do any of you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share? Yeah, John?
I wanted to thank you, Keith, for the way that you're sort of shepherding this, pun intended, sorry. But I don't have anything else. Karen is here with me, and she and I had a wonderful opportunity in January. We spent a couple of hours with Heather, and so I'm glad you opened it up to others.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jim, do you have anything you want to chime in here? Jim is another member of the committee. Jim?
Yeah, okay. I was trying to get it unmuted. Thanks. I have one question is, does anybody know what MOFGA has what position MOFGA has on these ordinance efforts?
I couldn't find anything. Heather, do you know if they've taken a position?
I do. Yeah, we worked with MOFGA over the years as well. And on the local food ordinance in particular, they haven't made a position that you can find because their membership is quite split about it. And so they always felt like when it came to farmers, they definitely supported what we were saying. And they also have members that are licensed farmers that were adamantly opposed. And so they didn't take a position either when the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was going through the legislature or on these ordinances.
Do you know what the nature of the opposition was? Like you said, they were adamantly opposed. Do they give reasons why they're opposed?
Yeah, and I can certainly go into that, but I do just want to say that the MOFGA on the right to food issue of enshrining a right to food of our own choosing and an unalienable right to food, including the right to save and exchange seeds and to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of our choosing. That MOFGA was in full support. They were one of our biggest allies and supporters in the state when it went to a statewide campaign. And Heather Spalding said over and over again, she thought that the United States Constitution needed to follow Maine's lead on that. And told me personally, she came to the celebratory potluck that we had when the right to food was enshrined in 2021. And was just so happy that she said personally, you know, that they wanted to support the Maine Food Sovereignty Act all along, but they couldn't because of the split of the membership's views. And when this became about all individuals rather than licensed producers, that they were just so thrilled that they could finally publicly support it. And then on the opposition, you mentioned why are some—
Yeah, what were some of the things you heard when people weren't in favor of it before?
Right. So I think I can tell you what they say and I can tell you my own perspective, but I'll try to just say what they say is that a lot of issues around market protection around if I had to do it, why doesn't everybody else have to do it? Mm-hmm. And I think many of the arguments could be distilled to that. And also to your question about, you know, isn't it easy to get a home processing license? There are many licensed producers, you know, for whom the financial piece was possible. That, as you know, privilege is sometimes blind. If it's possible for you, you can't see that it's not possible for everybody. And so then there was that feeling of fairness and then also not understanding that whether or not it's financially tenable, whether or not it's possible for you to build a separate piece of infrastructure for any of these particular foods. Depends a lot on what you start with. And a lot of licensed producers are starting with a different set of infrastructure than others of us have started with. So then, if you already start with a barn that has a kitchen in it or a processing room that's not too hard to update, then it's not an issue. So I am recalling that Representative Chapman, who was from our area when this was going through the legislature, said that he had, listened to all of the testimony from those for and against. And while some licensed producers were talking about food safety as a reason why the Maine Food Sovereignty Act shouldn't pass, they never provided any evidence of the food that was being produced under licensing and inspection, that it was any safer. They just had more anecdotes about their good relationships with inspectors, and not that it was doing anything to assure a higher quality or a safety concern. So yeah, I think, like I say, I am really slowing down. I'm recovering from a brain injury, and so when we get into a little bit later in the night, it gets a little harder for me to keep up with my own thoughts and make the connections. But I think that's the
No, thanks.
that I can bring forward about what the conflict was there.
You answered the question. So Jim, did you have any further questions or thoughts?
No, that's it. Fine, thank you.
Okay. Laura, did you have anything you wanted to bring up?
I do not.
Okay, just checking in.
Thank you.
So does anybody else have anything that we haven't hit upon yet?
I have.
Okay, Len.
I just have one simple question. Is the committee recommending that we approve this ordinance or not?
I can't speak for the whole committee. For myself, we're still gathering information. I have to process all that I've heard here tonight. I like to sit and think on what I've heard. We also reaching out to those in the food safety realm. There's a fellow who's here in town who is a health food safety person. Get their thoughts. Try to hear from different sides. I'm personally sympathetic to the issue. I am myself a large gardener, homesteader. I've been a market gardener, so I'm involved in this and am familiar with a lot of the issues and strongly believe in the importance of local food production, as some of the things that Billy Bob said in terms of, important to the community for many, many reasons, but there's the food security issue, but also what it does for a community to have producers in the area, I think is important for the land too. But in terms of coming to a decision, we're still in the process.
Well, I would hope that the committee would have a recommendation before it advises the town of what to do and say.
Yeah, we're not going to advise the town. We're going to advise the selectmen. That was our
Well, that's what I
task.
mean.
And then the selectmen will pass that on or take it in and make their recommendations. And regardless, of course, the town will be able to weigh in and give its thoughts. But yeah, no, thanks, Len. We're certainly we definitely do want to, and even regardless of what our decision, it's not so much decision, it's more just backing it up with why. These are the concerns we have, both for and against. And this is the information that's out there, so that others can make their decision. I think that's what I would see as us being tasked with. So does anybody have anything else? John?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It isn't really about your position, but it's your ability to articulate both the pros and the cons regarding the impact of this.
At the end of the day, though, it is about the decision.
Yeah, but that's for the voters to make. It's not our decision.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. So anything else? Heather, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, and I noticed Billy Bob does too, but I just wanted to say a quick word, especially for Len and Sarma being new to town, about process, because Maine's home rule and our town meeting tradition is really unusual in the country. And there are other New England states that do it, but that the process of deciding whether or not you want to enact this ordinance, it really does rest with the residents of the town at town meeting. And the select board chooses whether or not to put it on the warrant, or a resident like Lisa can petition the town to put it on the town warrant, which already happened at last spring. So my understanding is it will be on the next town meeting warrant.
Right.
And then it's up to the people in the town to decide if that's what you want to enact or not.
Heather, just to clarify, it could go on the town warrant, or it could be a special town meeting that deals with it. Just the town has to vote on it.
Okay. But it's great to have a meeting. It's great to have all of the discussions, but gathering all of the experts as you have done and spending all this time, it would be good to have a recommendation from the committee.
Thank you. So Billy Bob, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to chime in a little bit on the tail end of the MOFGA question that Heather was answering. Just wanted to say they were incredibly helpful and instrumental in the right food constitutional amendment. And I do know that Representative Bill Fluker, who is an independent representative in Warren, who is a organic farmer, has taken a job with MOFGA, and I know he's very supportive of the Food Sovereignty Act. Also, I just wanted to maybe give my perspective on what Heather said about the organization as a whole, coming up with an opinion on that. And I think that often when you get to the root of regulation, and this is across all industries, not just food industries, but a lot of what you see in regulation is about protectionism. And so regulation can be prohibitive to other people. So unfortunately, I even see that in the fishing industry. It's something I don't really like, when you make regulations to keep other people out. So that's kind of where I see any of the opposition to this, because I think you could just really look at the facts when it comes to food safety, and you're not going to find any issue with food safety when it comes to local food producers. That's my opinion on it. So I think that's where any opposition is going to come from. It's going to be regulation for those purposes, not safety purposes.
Okay, thank you, Billy. Anybody else?
Can I just say one thing, Keith?
Sure. Yeah.
I wanted to just clarify something for the committee that I don't think we exactly touched upon, but maybe we did. But if we didn't, I just want to make sure we touch upon it, that the ordinance that is in front of the voters, or that will be in front of the voters for consideration, is available at the town office to review. It will also be available at Saturday's potluck for people to take home with them so they can really look at it and understand it. It's based directly on the template from the organization that Heather works with, the local food rules. It's based on that template. It's meant to be a partner piece to the Maine State Food Sovereignty Act that's in the Constitution now. And what it has in it is consideration for issues that the selectmen brought up in January that were of concern to the town. So those are the only changes to that template. We're making sure that there wasn't liability for the town, and making sure that it was crystal clear what the obligation of any producer would be in terms of letting a customer know that they are not licensed. It's really important to know that people do not have the right to sell any food product and not let you know that they're not licensed. So that is now really clear and concrete in the ordinance that is before the town for consideration. And I also wanted for Jim and Keith's purposes, and Bonnie, when she sees this later, there was another frequently asked questions that talks about food safety. Bonnie said she was really concerned about food safety, and this frequently asked questions handout that I emailed today and will be available at the potluck as well, and is available through the town office because I emailed it to them as well. That covers some of the issues that Bonnie was concerned about that she sent in her email. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, well, thank you, everyone. If there's nothing else, I found this very helpful, so I really appreciate all of your time and thoughts. Yeah, and feel free to contact myself, either directly or through Lisa or John. They have my email. And I'm sure Jim would say the same. If you come up with something after this meeting, some information, some things that you want us to know, we're always open to hearing further. So I want to thank you. And yeah, we look forward to carrying on with this.
Yeah, thank you all for me. Bye.
Thank you.